So let's take a look at carbon metrics and in general and the power that these new metrics can bring to looking at your company through a new lens. First of all, there's two classes of reporting or uses of, at the highest level, two classes of carbon metrics. The first is for external reporting, like we've seen at the Carbon Disclosure Project and in CSR reporting. Generally, these reports are used for analysis of and looking at how the company is doing from an environmental perspective. Internal use, where the numbers really begin to focus on efficiency and effectiveness in your supply chain, is where these metrics become highly strategic. So let's look at some of these metrics and how they can be applied. Typically, our customers first want to look across their entire enterprise and supply chain to understand what is strategic. In this case, we're looking at a concrete manufacturer, and as you can see, and is I think fairly well known, cement is the glue that makes the concrete is the major impact and strategic to this manufacturer. But this gives management a perspective on where to focus their energy and resources, and in some cases on which suppliers they should be focusing on to further reduce their emissions and reduce their costs across the supply chain.
And Chris, quick question. Would this chart look the same if you just looked at the money, or is it significantly different since you're looking at the carbon associated with those inputs?
This would actually look quite different if you looked at the very though, for example, cement is a huge carbon contributor and obviously a very significant part of the supply chain costs, but relative to the carbon impact, the cost is significantly less. The other look then is to go from looking across the enterprise, across your enterprise, to specific suppliers. So if we were to drill down into our cement suppliers, now what we found in practice in measuring suppliers and working to do carbon labeling of various products is that companies begin by sharing the carbon footprint of a particular mix of concrete. But we're finding more and more that it's useful for this kind of a lens for companies to begin to work more closely together with suppliers. Because as you can see from this chart, the controllable parts of the carbon footprint for supplier 2 are much larger than supplier 2 or 1 or 3. So in this case, it may be more appropriate for the buyer to work in partnership with supplier number 2 to maximize the potential impact for lower carbon emissions, lower costs over time, and a more carbon efficient project, in this case a construction project. So we're finding that not only is carbon in the supply chain critical to a new critical measurement for selecting suppliers, but it's also a reason for suppliers and buyers to cooperate more closely in the supply chain. Another view, again, cutting more internally again, is to look at product line impact. This is unlike the top 20 or so we showed in the slide 2 earlier. This says, let's take a look at carbon across various product lines. And this is yet another lens to look at where an enterprise might want to focus their strategic efforts. Because carbon is a great metaphor for fossil fuel use, and most companies believe that fossil fuel is going to increase in price over the next couple of years, understanding your high carbon intensity products gives you a lens to begin to prioritize where you might want to redesign, remanufacture, or look for new materials to reduce that carbon impact and insulate your products from future profit erosion. So in this case, we're looking at wineries and we're looking at share of profit and share of revenue across various product lines and identifying which products have the highest carbon intensity and therefore the highest leverage in reducing carbon and maintaining profitability. Last of all, we can do forecasting of various changes. So if oil were to go to $100 a barrel and carbon at $18 a ton, we can do some scenario planning and suddenly see, for example, that both wine with 38% now is more is actually highly insulated, and we can identify where we might want to focus our reduction efforts. Last of all, generically, we think that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. I think that's sort of tried and true. So a large part of our core system capability is to help customers set targets and then manage quarterly or annually their reductions, looking at their performance across in a P&L perspective. This same kind of analysis can be done by product line or by material specifically, as it's done here in the top level of the chart. But the key is if you're going to be treating carbon as a strategic metric, we should be looking quarterly or at least semi-annually at the numbers and tracking our progress.
Chris, just a quick interruption since we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'll just read them all. One is, how did the company with the 123,000 tons of CO2 equivalents, how did they come up with that number? The second one is, what constitutes controllable, where you mentioned that? And then the third question is, how is the carbon output determined for each piece of the supply chain?
So number one, some of most of the numbers I showed you have been slightly modified to protect the particular confidential information, but all of the numbers you saw were produced through a climate Earth hybrid analysis of the supply chain and the enterprise using WRI standard protocol methodologies. The second question was...
WRI is World Resources Institute?
WRI, thanks, Paul. WRI is World Resources Institute. WRI-WBCSD is the generally accepted standard setter for the global standards in carbon accounting protocols. And let's see, the other question was, how is carbon output for cement measured? In this case, we used a combination of the Climate Earth database, which gave us industry averages. I'll show you more specifically that. And then we went directly to the supplier, in this case a couple of suppliers, and measured their direct emissions to calibrate and differentiate between suppliers.
And then there was a question about what's controllable versus not.
Yeah. So in that particular slide, we were looking at which emissions are more directly controllable versus indirectly controllable. And I think in that particular slide, in that particular case, the customer felt like the shipment distances to the source or the use of the concrete was not under their control. That was more had to do with where they were located, and they felt that moving plants was not something